wanted to say greetings from Vienna to everybody, and just as Matthias, I really regret that I couldn't be there with you today in person, but I guess the internet is the second best. And within our project in Vienna, I look at the NTE and the internationalization of minority rights during the 20th century. And I'm currently working on a monograph on transnational minority activism in interwar Europe that culminated in the creation in 1925 of the European Congress of National Minorities, or the ENC for short. And as many of you present already know, the ENC was created with a view of providing European minorities with a forum on which they could discuss, they could share experiences, discuss common problems, as well as air different ideas, and no less important, also vent their increasing frustration with the minority treaties that promised more on paper than actually delivered in practice. Minorities set up their quarters in Geneva not just because of the beautiful view of the lake, or because they wanted to be in the midst of the international community and rub shoulders, but most of all because they, one might say over-optimistically, hoped to inform and advise the nations on minority matters and ultimately perhaps even impacting its minority policies. And one of the ANC most notable undertakings was the proposal to the League of Nations to replace the treaties with non-territorial autonomy as a genuine pan-European minority rights framework. A proposal that, as you can easily guess, was ultimately rejected by the League. And in my research, I focus on two European minorities, namely the Germans and the Jews, and which did not just comprise the two biggest factions at the ANC, but were spearheading the minority rights movements in interwar Europe in general. And they also often joined forces both domestically and internationally, forming various alliances. As observed by the historian Esmer Mendelssohn, these were the two minorities that share remarkable similarities during the interwar period. Both were extraterritorial, both spoke their own language, professed their own religion different from the majority of the population in most countries. For Germans, both were predominantly urban minorities whose moderate elements were well integrated into the life of their host societies, becoming respectively Hungarian Germans or Latvian Jews. And both were also being constantly challenged by more extreme types advocating either German nationalism or radical Zionism. And in the 1930s, faced with the oppressive regimes at home and disappointed with the League of Nations, both started looking elsewhere. Germans to the right and Jews to Palestine. But at the same time, unlike Germans, Jews have never been in a dominant, position under the old imperial order, nor did they possess a kin state. However, it is all a matter of perception, and we know that perceptions matter. And in the eyes of the new and enlarged Central and East European state, which were predominantly agrarian and economically often backward, Jews possessed disproportionate economic power and were overrepresented in higher education. And it's also important to note that in between the two wars, the international Jewish organizations such as the British Joint Foreign Committee, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, and the French Alliances Élite Universelle were advocating on behalf of the Jews in front of the League of Nations. They often acted and also negotiated with nation states on their behalf. They often acted as kin state proxies. And in my project, I look at 3 interwar countries: Poland, Romania, and Latvia, where both minorities were present in significant numbers. And I like working, I like focusing on individuals and following their paths. So I traced the individual paths of several minority activists, namely Itzhak Birnbaum and Erwin Hasbach from Poland, Mayer Abner and Rudolf Branch from Romania, and Max Laserson and Paul Schiemann from Latvia. And I traced their paths from those countries to the ENC in Geneva. And another person who looms large in my research is the ENC vice president and the head of the Jewish faction of the Nationalities Congress, Zionist Leo Motzkin. Within the ENC, he was known as a member without a country, because everybody else was a delegate from a particular country. But Motzkin was originally from Ukraine. He lived in Berlin since the age of 14, where as a prodigy mathematician he was sent to study. He was very much integrated into the German Jewish community, which was markedly different from East European Jewish communities, and also had a very different as German Jews, like other Western Jews, like the Jews in England and in France, did not consider themselves a minority. And in this sense, Motzkin was not unlike the British-born Jewish journalist Lucien Wolfe, whose family came to London from Bohemia. Both were highly acculturated into their respective societies. Well, Wolfe was arguably was as English as one can get, and was also known to have slightly aristocratic pretensions. Both had international standing. Both, in a way, were torn between the West and the East, but ultimately dedicated their lives to the tireless advocacy of minority rights of the to the minority rights, not just of the Jews, but just the minorities of the Central and Eastern Europe. And during the interwar period, they to some extent competed in their attempts to represent the Jewish minorities of the minority section of the League of Nations. It must be said that the conjoint committee of the British Board of Jewish Deputies and the Anglo-Jewish Association, headed by Lucien Wolfe, because of its close ties to Whitehall, and let's not forget that Britain was like a heavyweight at the League. So the submissions of Lucien Wolfe carried more weight with the Secretariat, and it was a tough act for Motzkin of the Committee of Jewish Delegations based in Paris to follow. But I discovered that a closer look, actually, the archival documents reveals that their dedication to the common cause facilitated more cooperation that first meets the eye. And unlike other Western Jews who were largely opposed to both minority rights and anti-aid, Wolfe was an ardent advocate of the former, and during the course of his life grew progressively fonder of the latter. And indeed, his secretary David Maszkowicz mentioned that Wolfe had envisioned in some distant future the transformation of the Board of Jewish Deputies into a national association along the Renarian lines. As for Motzkin, his dedication to minority rights to a certain extent very much endangered his place at the Zionist pantheon. As one fellow Zionist unkindly wrote in his memoir, Motzkin did more for the benefit of the non-Jewish minorities than he did for the Jews. And from that relatively little-known book, this characterization made it into the seminal Walter Lacker's History of Zionism. But back to my other protagonist, from the commitment to parliamentary democracy and the determination to exercise minority rights given them by the treaties in practice, were all champions of anti-aid. One can rightly say that it was the interest in NTA that got us together in the first place. And I'd like to stress that their understanding of NTA is based not so much upon the concept of minority protection, but upon the principles of equality, democratic fairness, and, as some argued, divided sovereignty. And if we draw a historical parallel here to this morning's keynote speech and Levante's conclusion about the possible informal arrangements for NTA, I must say that back in those days, those activists were hell-bent on the right of NTA to be officially enshrined in national as well as international legislation. As legal specialists, they were all trained legal scholars or practicing lawyers, and they were all convinced of the supremacy and inviolability of legal norms. And another striking common feature which ties my protagonists together was that they were all highly acculturated and integrated into their home countries and cultures. They all came from well-heeled families, received excellent education, all at some point studied in German universities, as was the fashion at the time, and all spoke multiple languages. All were the members of their respective parliaments, where they were among the most active politicians, in no way limiting themselves to minority interests. On the contrary, they were very invested in the matters of the state and very much respected by their majority politicians, not necessarily liked, but respected. Professions. I think everybody aside from Hasbach, who was an agricultural specialist, and Motzkin, who, as I mentioned, trained as a mathematician. Everybody else had a degree in law, and Lazarson, for one, continued to teach the law while also being a minority leader. So, in other words, they were all but equipped for success in a wider world and could have chosen many different paths. Minority rights advocacy for them was a conscientious choice, and for some also a sacrifice, like for Motzkin. And rather than it is often alleged against minority activists to this day, they pursued to advance some personal agendas. And we should also keep in mind that it takes a rather high degree of assimilation to be able to truly understand its limits. And they are a perfect illustration of that. Another interesting feature is that my German protagonists come from a wide political spectrum, from liberal Schumann to conservative Hasbach. But my Jewish protagonists are all Zionists. And of course, as in any other political movement, there were many currents and opposing factions in Zionism as well. And in fact, one of the biggest schisms was the division between the so-called Palästina-Arbeit and Gegenwartsarbeit, or in other words, the work dedicated exclusively to the future Jewish home in Palestine, or the one focused on the present task of alleviating the Jewish situation in diaspora through the active participation in the political life of the new nation states. So, all my protagonists were the hardened Gegenwartsarbeiters. In fact, Grünbaum and Motzkin were, along with the future revisionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky, as Zionist revisionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky, the authors of the famous Gegenwartsarbeit resolution that was adopted at the Third Congress of Russian Zionists in Helsingfors back in 1906. And I would also like to stress that the Helsingfors resolution already contained a very detailed outline of the future organization of Jewish NTA in accordance with the latest, at the time, theory. As well as that, it contained, by the suggestion of Jabotinsky, it defined as one of the nearest tasks for the future the identification of other non-territorial groups in Russia with a view of organizing them in a common struggle for minority rights. The Helsingfors Congress was, of course, inspired by the revolution of 1905 and the seemingly imminent democratization of the Russian Empire. The reaction was swiftly followed after, put most of these plans on ice until World War I, and they would not publicly resurface until the end of the war, and in particular the Paris Peace Conference, where the Jewish advocacy for minority rights was famously based on the autonomy principles, and it was thanks to their persistence that some of those principles found their way into minority treaties themselves. And in the new democratic states of East and Central Europe, Jewish minority activists started implementing those principles in practice with admirable determination. Indeed, the famous minority bloc that was put together by Yitzhak Grunbaum and Erwin Hasbach for the Polish parliamentary election of 1922, it was a joint list of the Jewish, German, Ukrainian, and Russian minorities. It was characterized by the historian David Vital as the Gegenwartsarbeit with a vengeance. The Polish minority bloc had a resounding electoral success, but in practice the gain by majority was still not enough to make a decisive input in the Polish Sejm. The relationship between the Poles and the minorities continued to deteriorate. The same could be said about Romania, where Mayor Ebner and Rudolf Branch fought the Romanizing education reform with great valor. And in Latvia, Szyman and Lazarson put an ultimately futile fight to pass the laws on minorities' autonomy through the parliament. And increasingly frustrated by the resistance on the part of the nation state to grant them any meaningful participation and the limited agency provided by minority treaties, those activists turned their attention towards the international arena. And Szyman and Moltke were among the founders of the ANC, and all others were very active delegates. But as I mentioned before, their hopes were more successful for a more sympathetic hearing at an international level was eventually dampened too. The Minority Secretariat of the League of Nations kind of gave them a cold shoulder. The aforementioned proposal to replace minority treaties with an NTA framework was rejected on the grounds that a spirit of tolerance and liberalism would hardly be encouraged by institutionalizing separation between groups. Besides, there was no unanimous support for NTA within the Congress, too, as more territorially concentrated minorities saw it as a lesser option. The Congress was experiencing constant financial difficulties. It was becoming increasingly dependent on the subsidies from the German government, and with the demise of Gustav Stresemann, it became a liability, as well as ultimately contributing to the Congress's eventual demise. And this brings me to the infamous Bern Congress of 1933, which brought this short-lived German Jewish minority collaboration to an abrupt end. And just before the Congress, the Jewish faction sent a letter to the Presidium of the Congress asking them to issue a public condemnation of the recent anti-Jewish legislation passed in Germany. And to make a very long story short, that condemnation was issued, and the Jewish faction left the Congress, never to return. And in their absence, the Congress eventually lost its relevance to the minority rights movement and was turned into an instrument of Nazi propaganda before ceasing to exist in 1938. Now the Congress of 1933 cast a very long shadow over the Congress and over the concept of NTA by association, whilst the subsequent collapse of the League of Nations system put the whole concept of minority rights into disrepute for years to come. The ANC, in its first 8 years of existence, has been largely recognized by the latest historical research as a truly democratic institution, the aftertaste still lingers. And the publications as recent as 2018 portrayed the Congress as a kind of a honey trap set up by Germans for unsuspecting Jews. And I think this lingering perception is due to the historical distortion that the seemingly helpful lens of hindsight usually provides. In other words, the perception of the 1933 Birth Congress is tinged with the knowledge of the tragedy of the Holocaust that followed, rather than examined in its own historical context. Because if you place the Birth Congress firmly in 1933 where it belongs, it all starts to look slightly different. The decision, although the official condemnation was never issued, it was not a decision taken lightly, although that mattered unanimously. And to the credit of the Catalan, Hungarian, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian factions, they insisted they managed to put the following sentence added to the final resolution of the Congress. I quote, "We consider the wave of particularly anti-Semitic measures that have recently been observed in some states, violation of general human rights, as violations of general human rights and irreconcilable with the principles of our Congress." Of course, it's formulation. Sorry, it was suddenly an echo.
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, we're coming to the end, Marina, of the time slot. So yeah.
I'm coming to the end of my presentation. And if the Congress demonstrated timidity when it came to the actual defense of minority rights, so did the League of Nations when it met for its 14th Assembly in October 1933, because their resolution also didn't name Germany as a perpetrator, and as the Times commented next day, involved no more than a pious hope than the state of belief to treat their minority with temporary decency. Has anti-Semitism penetrated the Congress? Without any doubt. Was it infiltrated by Nazi sympathizers? So we can be certain of that, but we will put the struggle to find a corner of Europe where totalitarian ideology did not put a foothold by 1933. It is not my intention by any means to absolve the Congress of guilt. They're guilty as charged, they betrayed their Congress. I guess what I object to is that some were unfair singling out for repeated attempts of taking it into historical context. And referring again to the keynote this morning, I think also for its marked role of this in pushing the concept of NTE into that state of inappropriateness, as Entan put it. So now that of course, like the present-day political situation is markedly different, but it's also painfully clear that some similarities persist, and now that NTE has a chance of being used here, I think that history of this Congress and this vertical liberation is always really good. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for overrunning slightly, and we'll be happy to answer the questions later.
Thank you so much, Marina. And Matthias, I owe you an apology because I got the order mixed up of the papers. I think I'm having a case of brain fog today, so apologies for that. You're next. But before we come to you, I'll open the floor to questions for Marina, please. I was indeed struck by the resonance with this morning's keynote, and that if we think of this kind of transnational activism that existed, most of the recent accounts would say that it formed part of a wider international civil society insofar as it did interact with non-minority, non-ethnic based networks. And I think, it's an interesting question to consider, to go back to that notion of a state-centric world and the extent to which a transnational civil society can actually not sort of challenge that and abolish it, but kind of moderate it and, attain some kind of actiness within the international system. And clearly the interwar period was not a propitious time for that. But as you say, Marina, these things shouldn't be viewed with the dubious benefit of hindsight, but should be considered in their own right. And I think it is an important and interesting case. Any questions? I mean, again, I hope we will have some time at the end for some general wrap-up questions that might bring the different presentations together, but we'll move on for now. Thank you.